It can be more than one book club. What books are you interested in? It. What books would you like to have discussed? What are kind of the conditions under which you would regularly like to attend? Uh, it's an open-ended survey, so be looking for that in your email, and uh, you can ignore it if you want. But if you're in the least bit interested, be looking for it and don't let it get past you, and reply to it, and that'll guide our thinking about how we might be able to do this in a way that's relaxing and uh, stimulating for as many people as we can get. So that's the announcement about that. Uh, are there any guests at any table that I should point out that uh, Jim?
Yes, I'd like to introduce my friend and neighbor. We've been neighbors for 40 plus years. We were just out for dinner a couple weeks ago, and our kids grew up together. And now the kids are all grown with lives of their own and all this stuff. So you see how quickly time goes. But Nancy Shermanhorn is our guest this evening. I'm so happy to have you here.
Nancy Schimmerhorn. Remember that. Hope you'll be back.
My guest is Patricia Randall, the mayor of Portage.
Glad to have you with us. Anyone else who has guests this evening?
It is going to be difficult because my wife's just gone to the bathroom. Yeah, so I'm here with my wife, Sarah. We'll be, sorry?
Tell us her name. Tell us her name.
Oh, sorry, I'm Ivan Richards. And my wife's here somewhere in the building.
What's her name?
Sarah.
What is her name?
Sarah.
Sarah Richards. Very good. Thank you. Good. Any other guests that we have here this evening? Oh, uh, le- there you are. Len, do you have a guest?
My guest is my wife, Linda Ginsberg.
And that leads me right into introducing our speaker for this evening, Len Ginsberg, who is a professor emeritus from Western, who has uh, two PhDs, one in a PhD and a post, not a post-op, a postdoc. There we go. It's right there. So I don't have to say what you can read. I'm just going to turn it right over to him right now because you all know him pretty well. He's given us other talks before that you may recall were very good.
Thanks. Yeah, this talk's going to be all Jack Urban's fault. Last October, he came up to me and he said, I want you to give a talk next year, but it has to be about science. So I went home and I wrote down some things that I was interested in reading or I had read about different areas of science technology. And hence the name came up. Is it a human? I'll talk about this in a second. A science talk. So this is all Jack's fault. And because normally I give stuff that talks about wine tasting and all kinds of other stuff. And anyway, so these were the three topics that I came up with and that I was reading on: evolution of humans and ancient DNA, when in development are we humans, and AI and humanoids. But I try as I couldn't put them all together to make one talk, or you would have been here till next Tuesday. So I've decided to talk about the human evolution and ancient DNA, which was by far the most scientific of the three topics. And I turned out very interesting. I think I even found Adam and Eve along the way. So we'll see how it came out. So if we look at the public opinion of where we are with human evolution, we see that about 60% of the adults now think that humans did evolve. We don't know how much they evolved, but they did evolve. This is up from previous surveys. And then but about 30 to 40% think that humans didn't evolve at all, that they were created about 10,000 years ago and never interacted with any other animals. And then if you ask the question slightly differently and ask whether humans developed from earlier species of animals, now 60% of the people say no, they didn't. So they believed in evolution, but only a little bit of evolution, not a lot of evolution. This is in US. So the field of human evolution really has been going on for about 75 years, mostly looking at fossils. Paleontologists have been all over the world finding fossils in Europe and Africa and so forth, and done an amazing job. So I'm not blaming them for what I'm talking about tonight. So you'll see. And in the beginning, about 2000, there began a series of ways to analyze DNA to look at these fossils. And the two often clashed. The old data from the paleontologists didn't exactly match the data from the bone studies that have been done. So when I began to read in this area, it was very confusing. A lot of conflicting theories of what was going on. And so one January day, I got up and it was snowing and cold outside. And so I dusted off my geneticist hat and put it on and said, I'm going to go back into the literature, back to the original papers, and see if I could come up with a more unified theory as a geneticist. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Okay? So this begins with what is a human, and we have a definition, two definitions to begin with. First is a hominid with a D at the end, and a hominid is a great ape. We don't come from monkeys, we come from great apes. And the great apes consist of the chimpanzees, the gorillas, the orangutans, the bonobos, and us. We are great apes. So if you're looking for a Halloween costume, I can suggest going out and looking for a great ape costume, or even better, you can simply find a Lone Ranger mask and a t-shirt and write on it, I'm a great ape looking for candy. And that should suffice. I would put hominid on the back to show that you're serious. That's science. So the other term is a hominin, and hominins are human-like great apes. And there used to be lots of different kinds, but now it's only us. And but you can divide the hominins into two types: ancient hominins, like Lucy and Australopithecus. Those are the ancient ones, and the modern hominins. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is the evolution of modern hominins into humans. All right. And so the difference between the two is that the modern ones walk upright all the time, no knuckle dragging. Their limbs are shorter, and their arms are shorter, and their legs are longer. They have small incisors, relatively small teeth, except for the few vampires that come out this time of the year. But most of them have very small incisors. The brain is larger, and they are creative, artistic. And so they make stone tools, and they decorated the caves with paint, with artistry, and so forth, and jewelry, and so forth, and so on. And reasoning, this one I'm not quite sure about. The sapiens means wise or philosopher. And except for this distinguished group, my experience with humans has not been that most of them are wise or philosophers. In fact, most of them will go to Yellowstone and try to take a selfie with a bison or a bear. And I think most squirrels would do better than that. So the appearance is also important because the original ancient um, hominins look pretty much like something out of Planet of the Apes. And the modern ones look like something you might see at Walmart or Olympics or someplace else. Okay? So if we put together a little organizational chart of modern hominids, by the way, paleontologists came up with 15 different species of modern hominids. And I've narrowed it down to 5. All right. And the top one is Homo erectus. Most anthropologists agree that Homo erectus is probably the first modern human. Okay. They found fossils back 1.9 million years ago. Not 10,000 years ago, but 1.9 million years ago. And they existed for at least 1.5 million years before they went extinct. So a very long time. They were probably came out of East Africa, and they had and all the hominins at one point had to migrate because of the plate tectonics, because of changes in climate. So they actually migrated over into India, at least some of them did, over into India and down into Java. So about 800,000 years ago, coming off of the Homo erectus, evolving directly from them, was something called Heidelberg. I call it Heidelberg, but sometimes you'll see it as Heidelberg Genesis. So this particular creature looked a little more human-like, and it migrated north and south. It started out in Africa, about the same place as East Africa, and then migrated north up into Heidelberg and south down into Rhodesia. So they did a north-south one. And they then morphed into Neanderthals. They evolved pretty directly into Neanderthals, and a minor group broke off into something called Denisovans. So this Neanderthals were quite amazing. In their height, they had people from all the way from Spain all the way over to Siberia. They lived in small groups, and they learned how to make clothing. They learned how to live in the cold climates, and they evolved genes so they could live in the cold climate. The Denisovans were even wilder. They like to live in the mountains and high elevations, and they developed genes to live at high altitude. And they lived in places like Tibet and New Guinea, up in the high mountains of New Guinea and so forth. And so a much smaller group. And then finally, sapiens appeared about 250,000 years ago. Sapiens showed up in some place in Africa. Not quite clear exactly where they started out. And then they lived in much larger groups. They lived in tribes, and they came up sort of in mass about 50,000 years ago, in the same range as Neanderthals and the Denisovans. So now the question is, did they mate? We'll have to hold on to find out. So about 1990s began to develop a lot of tools for using DNA to study DNA. And some you know about PCR, the polymerase chain reaction, which is used for forensics and for discovering whether you have COVID other things like that. It measures very small amounts of DNA. Genotyping, which is what 23andMe and Ancestry DNA uses for telling what ancestors you have. And DNA sequencing, which is trying to determine the order of bases in the DNA. Okay? And in the 1990s, this was a really hot time for doing this kind of work. This is when the Human Genome Project began. And they were trying to figure out what the 3.2 billion bases were in 23 of our 46 chromosomes. And that was a tremendous achievement because in the beginning, nobody thought they could do it. The sequencing technique was so poor and took so long that some people estimated it would take them 50 years to come up with the 3 billion base sequence. But they got a lot of money from various governments. And so they got about $300 million. And some of them went to biotech firms to invent machines that could sequence DNA. And other parts of this money, and this is a DNA sequencer here, and while others went to computer scientists to get all the data from these machines and figure out how to put it together to make a chromosome. So it was a tremendous amount of work, and it only took them 13 years to sequence human DNA. Today, with the advances in this technology, it could take about a day or two. And it would cost, latest value I saw was about $600. So we made tremendous strides in this. And about 2000, when the Genome Project was finishing, people began to look for other ways of using this technology, all the computer programs and so forth. At the Max Planck Institute in 2000, Savante Pabal, pronounced something like that, wanted to look at mummies and ancient bones. And so he began using these techniques to do that. And it sounds rather simple. What he wanted to do is have a paleontologist give him a bone. He would drill a hole in it and then put some fluid in, extract the DNA, and do sequencing or PCR or whatever he was going to do with it. But it was not that simple. First of all, the DNA over time degrades. And so he was dealing with sometimes pieces of DNA that were only 50 bases long. And he was trying to figure out how they fit together to make 3 billion bases. And the second thing is sometimes the amount of DNA he extracted was so low that there was more DNA on the surface of the bones from the people who were handling it than there was in the bones. And so he had to come up with tremendous protocols to try to figure out how you would do this without getting contamination, how to collect these small pieces of DNA and make them into a larger piece. So by 2010, he had sequenced Neanderthal genome, even though they've been extinct since 40,000 years ago. He was able to sequence the entire Neanderthal genome from these little tiny pieces. And in 2022, he got the Nobel Prize for his work in ancient DNA. And this summer, they announced that they had sequenced the Denisovan genome. And subsequently, there have been a lot of sequencing or partial sequencing of Neanderthals that from different ages, some at 400,000 years, some 200,000 years, some 50,000 years, and so forth. So, so at this point, thousands of ancient, so this is called ancient DNA or aDNA. And ancient DNA is very popular now. All kinds of things have been, all kinds of bones have been recovered by using ancient DNA. And I just wanted to mention that Neanderthal DNA is actually very close to human DNA. If we say a chimpanzee differs from humans by 1.2% in their DNA, Neanderthal is only about 0.3% different than human. And if we look at the difference between the various races of humans, that's about 0.1%. So very closely related to us. And you'll see why coming up. So here's Linda and I, or actually Linda, and on our just recent trip, we just got back, and I'm calling this our Pub and Ancient People Tour. And we went to Stonehenge, and we went to various spots. And this is Newgrange, which is in Ireland. And in all these places, the tour guides were talking about ancient DNA. They were all using ancient DNA to find out who had lived in these burial mounds at Newgrange. And Stonehenge was also doing the same thing, trying to use it. So it's all right. Well, one of the techniques that you could use to see if we're related or if they mated with Neanderthal is genotyping. And genotyping is a special technique. It's not sequencing. It relies upon mutations, and this is called an SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism, or as we call it, SNP. And somewhere in the genome, most people have, for example, a G base in a position. But every once in a while, it mutates, and so there are some populations that have a T in that position. Okay? And there are actually 10 million of these possible in human DNA. And when 23andMe tests for your heredity, they look at 700,000 different SNPs to see which ones you have, and then compare it to general populations. It's all done by computers, very cheap to do, and then you get sued. You know. So we can then look at see how if we're related or if our ancestors are Neanderthal. So this is my when I have my DNA tested, this is my Neanderthal test. And what they do is once they have the sequence for Neanderthals, they went through and looked for these unique SNPs that were unique for Neanderthal. And then they tested my DNA to see if I had any of those unique ones. Okay? And it turned out that that I had 219 unique ones, Neanderthal ones, out of about 3,000 or so that they tested. And 9 of them were both my mother and father gave me, and the rest of them, one of the other gave me. If you look at this figure, that's each of those lines represents one of my chromosomes. The horizontal lines are one of my chromosomes, from the largest to the smallest down here. And each of the little red lines represents where the Neanderthal SNP was. You see that? Rich sees it? And so you could see I have Neanderthal all over my genome. Okay? It's a lot of, seems like a lot, but it's actually only a couple percent. Right? So clearly, somebody mated with Neanderthals. It wasn't my parents, it was somebody. All right? And so if you were to look at a big population like the United States who went to 23andMe, you find out that on average, about 2% of non-African DNA is Neanderthal DNA. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is. So I'll come back to that in a second. And overall, 40% of the Neanderthal genome can be found today in our DNA, if you look at all the humans that were tested. So there was a lot. Now, why is 2% a lot? Well, it has to do with dilution. And you share 50% of your DNA with your parents. But then your spouse comes in. And so your kids only share 25% with your parents. Everybody understand that? So it got diluted out. And so then the next generation, your kids are down to 12.5% shared with your parents. And about the next generation, it's in single digits. Okay? So having 2% DNA from Neanderthal after 40,000 years, 2,000 generations is a lot. Okay? So there must have been a huge number of hybrids that occurred. Oh, let me see. Go back up. Okay. And so we can now look at sequencing data, and you can actually sequence the people in the current population who have these SNPs that are from Neanderthal. All right, and you can actually sequence it, and you can compare that sequence to the actual DNA from Neanderthals. And what you'll find is that there will be new mutations have occurred between the time the Neanderthal genes were there and the current people who have the Neanderthal DNA. And knowing that, you can do something called DNA mutation dating. That's what I call it. This is different from dating a mutant. So this is a way of calculating how long ago something happened. And you were going to see it a couple times in the rest of the talk. All right? And when you do that, a new paper came out and said that on average, sapiens mated with Neanderthals on average about 47,000 years ago. That was the average time. And they continued to mate, not the same person, but they continued to mate with them for 7,000 years until basically Neanderthals went extinct. All right? So that's a long time of mating. So not only did they mate with Neanderthals, but they probably learned the culture of Neanderthals. They learned how to make clothing and so forth, and various things of that nature. The same thing happened with Denisovan. When the sapiens got into their range, they mated with them. And so this summer, so these papers kept coming out very quickly, and I had to keep changing the talk. So this summer, important paper in the journal Science came out, which confirmed that last study. And basically what they did was they looked at the Neanderthal genes, DNA over time, from about 4,000 years ago through the time when the matings occurred. And they looked at sapien DNA over the same time. And what they found out was that sapiens DNA began to look more and more like Neanderthal DNA. And Neanderthal DNA began to look more and more like sapien DNA. And then finally, about 40,000 years ago, there was only a couple thousand Neanderthals left, and they just merged with the population. So it really wasn't an extinction, it was a merger between the sapiens and the Neanderthals so that they all became one. So this is how sapiens got to rule the world. They slept with everybody. They slept their way to the top. They got all the genes that would have taken hundreds of thousands of years to evolve from the Denisovans and from Neanderthals. And they got some of the culture of how to live in these different environments. And then they just spread out and took over the rest of the world. So, but the question is, were they really sapiens anymore? They were really sapien slash Neanderthal slash Denisovans, and what we could just say they were human. And they began to take over the world. So the question is how, so this says to me as a biologist that they were all one species. There was only one species, probably back to Homo erectus. There's only one species because in biology, a species has to do with reproduction. So if two animals can reproduce and produce viable offspring, they're considered the same species, right? However, I learned that paleontologists have a different definition of species, which it's called the species problem because there are 20 different definitions of species in different fields. And so the paleontologists call a species if the skull looks different or if the bones look different. So that's how they wound up with 15, and I only wound up with a few. And this is where it's really good for the paleontologists because it's very nice to say on your tenure report that you found a new species of humans rather than saying, oh, I found another offshoot of Homo erectus. So this was very good for them, and it kept everybody busy over the years too. You know. All right, so there's one more part of this talk, and this is called the mystery of chromosome 2. So as I was looking through the paleontology literature, every once in a while I came up with there was a mention of something about a mystery of chromosome 2. And I like mysteries as much as anybody. So I thought, well, I might as well, and a chromosome 2 sounded genetic. So I thought I might as well look into this. And it turned out to be very interesting. Back in 1960, we finally learned how to count chromosomes in humans. Sounds unbelievable, but it was only 1960. And when they counted the chromosomes in humans, they found out that current humans have 46 chromosomes. But then they went to study the chromosomes in gorillas and chimpanzees, orangutans, and they all had 48 chromosomes. So there was one pair of chromosomes that was missing in humans. And of course, the creationists went crazy. They thought this was great because that definitely proved that humans were separated from all these other creatures because they even had a different chromosome number. But as our techniques for studying chromosomes got better and better, it became clear what was going on. And so part of the mystery was solved. And here we can see the what 1960s chromosome spread would look like, just dark blobs without the numbers on. It was really difficult to tell one chromosome from another. But here's more modern, and this is more like a karyotype where they've cut these out and pasted them side by side. But in this particular case, they pasted the human chromosome next to a chimpanzee chromosome. And humans and chimpanzees have a common ancestor about 6 million years ago, but they're still pretty similar. So if you were to look at these, you would say, well, sure, they look pretty much alike, humans, except for chromosome 2. Right, see that? So chromosome 2 in humans is one fused chromosome, whereas in chimpanzees, it is 2 chromosomes. Actually, they're chromosome 12 and 13. Everybody with me on this? So this is a very common genetic abnormality, and it's called the translocation. It's actually this particular one where you fuse a chromosome end to end. It's called the Robertsonian translocation, and it occurs about 1 in every 900 individuals, male or female, at birth. So it's very common to do this. And this was a Robertsonian translocation. And what you can see what's going to happen. So let me go back. So what happens in these Robertsonian translocations is some of these V-shaped chromosomes fuse together end to end. And there's not much at the top of these V-shaped chromosomes except called the telomeres. Anybody heard of a telomere before? So telomeres are repeating units of DNA that are help to protect the ends of the chromosome, but they're also needed for the enzyme that is going to synthesize DNA to bind to that telomere so that it can move down and synthesize the DNA before cell division. If you don't have a telomere, the chromosome would keep getting shorter and shorter and shorter each time it replicates. Anyway, so what happened over here is this telomere, you can see it right here, that telomere is going to be included in the translocation, in the fusion, right? But this chromosome is going to miss a pretty good part of it. It's going to be deleted when the two fuse together. All right, you all buying this? Okay. Okay. So we don't know that person is exactly going to look like, but we'll tell you in a minute. So here's another way of looking at this. This is a different stain. This is a fluorescent stain that also shows the chromosomes in a current human. And it's also stained for the telomere. So you can actually see where there's a telomere in the middle of chromosome 2. Still there today. And the question is, how long ago did this happen? How long ago did the fusion occur? And by using that mutation DNA dating system, it turns out that it occurred 900,000 years ago. That the fusion actually occurred 900,000 years ago. And what that means is that Neanderthals are also 46, and Denisovans are 46, and likely Heidelbergs are 46. So they're and the Sapiens are 46. So this means they had a common ancestor back about 900 or 800,000 years ago that had 46 chromosomes. So Sapiens didn't appear magically someplace in Africa and then dominate the world. They were already closely related to the other one. Nod your head like you understand. Yeah, sure, that's good. Okay, so you're okay. So, they must have a common ancestor, and if you were to Google the common ancestor, Neanderthals and Sapiens, you'll find out that there's a common ancestor about 700,000 years ago, and it was probably Heidelberg. So Heidelberg was probably the common ancestor and probably gave rise to both Neanderthals, Denisovans, and ultimately the Sapiens. Okay? So part of the mystery was solved, okay, of chromosome 2, but there's another part. So while the translocation is very frequent, almost nobody goes and loses a whole pair of chromosomes. Okay? And that's because the first person who had the translocation actually would have had 47 chromosomes. They would have inherited a fused chromosome from one parent, and they would have inherited two separate chromosomes from the other parent, right? And whereas the 46 would have two fused ones and a 48 would have, in their normal cell, in their eggs or cells. And the problem is that the cell doesn't know how to make eggs and sperm out of these three. So instead of having like that or like that, eggs and sperm, they make 8 different eggs and sperm, a little bit of everything. So the fertility, so the person is perfectly normal until they try to have a child. And then they're only about 20% fertile. Right? And what happens to the rest of these result in miscarriages. They're produce monosomies and trisomies that are miscarried sometime during pregnancy. So how in the heck did this original person ever get to have 46 chromosomes in the whole population? What happened to the 48s? What happened to the 47? So this is a big mystery. And I've done a little bit of a cross here, and the only way you can get to a 46 is if you mate two 47s together. And of course, there'd only be 20% fertile with all those miscarriages. And even so, only 1 out of 4 of the viable offspring would have been 46. So that's overall, that's about 5% chance of having a 46. And then in order to get that become, say, Heidelberg, you would have to mate this with another male or female in order to get more 46s, and they'd have to walk away from everybody else. Because if they didn't, they would start having 47s and 48s and it'd be a mess. Well, it took, okay, all right. So it's interesting that this 900,000 years number is the same number that paleontologists have been reporting for a long time as to when humans almost went extinct. So about 900,000 years ago, humans almost went extinct, and paleontologists couldn't find fossils of any of the types of hominins that they were looking for in that region. And they didn't recover for 100,000 or so years. Okay? So, what actually, and it recovered about 800,000 years ago, which is about the time when Heidelberg came into existence. So what had actually happened? So this is something I paced the floor for a number of weeks, trying to see if I could come up with what actually happened. And it became clear that there was some kind of an advantage to having a fused chromosome. That this loss, oh, by the way, the loss, what people have claimed that it was climate changes or other things that caused the human population to collapse, but nobody has been able to really figure out exactly why the population collapsed. So I think that there was something else that caused the collapse, and that the people with the fused chromosome were protected from it. Right? So I looked through the literature of chromosome 2, and some articles came up that there were a lot of immune genes on chromosome 2, and that one of those was protective against tuberculosis in Africa. So it's possible that the 48s all either died of tuberculosis or moved away, and the 46s stuck around because they were immune to tuberculosis and eventually moved off to become Heidelberg. Okay? So when I was looking through chromosome 2, I came upon this paper, and this paper was out of Baylor. And he asked the question in the paper, did Adam and Eve have 46 chromosomes? And he drew this pedigree, uh, which matches exactly the data that I did on my one a couple slides ago. In this pedigree, in a pedigree, the squares are male. I don't know why this came out that way, but the squares are always male, and the circles are always female. The triangles are miscarriages, and the partially filled ones have 47 chromosomes, and the fully filled ones have 46 chromosomes, right? So what he proposes is there was a dominant male from a normal parents who was his first translocation carrier and mated with a whole bunch of females, and they all had a lot of miscarriages, but eventually two 47s mated, and they had a 1 in 4 chance of having Eve. And on the other side, the same thing happened, but it turned out to be a male. And so maybe we're all descendants from these people, and that the original translocation somehow saved the human population from going extinct. And that's the end of the story. Any questions?
I just want to say Neanderthal did a great job mating sapien because the immune system that we have is from Neanderthal. That good, strong immune system of human being right now mostly is related to our ancestor Neanderthal.
Right.
So be very proud of 2 to 4% gene that you got from Neanderthal.
Right.
Again, I really enjoyed that. What did you run across with the mitochondrial DNA in terms
Yeah,
of
the mitochondrial DNA, I'm not as thrilled about mitochondrial DNA as nuclear. Mitochondria have their own little quirks. They only come from females. Mitochondrial DNA, the theory is that there were only a few women who gave rise to all of humanity. And somehow you can mesh that with the what I talked about, which is population collapse, and then those few people starting Heidelberg. So they may be related.
And the first cell that did not have this machinery for energy production, these are basically bacteria. That's why they have discrete DNA separate from the nucleus. They have double membrane, very much like the bacteria. And when they divide like bacteria. They don't divide like the rest of the organelle in the cells. So the mitochondria are the leftover of the bacteria which invaded the first cell, which was a prokaryote. And as a result, we are just this symbiosis of the energy production between this and that made us the rest of evolution. And we are, again, enjoying that symbiosis.
But mitochondrial DNA has some idiosyncrasies. They mutate at a much higher rate, and the female, when they're in the egg, the mitochondria egg are different. They kill certain mitochondria and not others. So it's not equally distributed. And so there are a lot of games that are played by the mitochondria that may have influenced some of the results they get. Yeah, same idea.
Great talk. Great talk. Thank you very much. You described the mating of the Neanderthals and the sapiens as sort of like a dinner and a movie. Uh, more likely it was the result of conquest and rape, something like that. Do the paleontologists or your work give us any insight into which of these were the physically more capable and dominant?
Well, let me go back to that thing, and I was going to mention this, but it's a mixed crowd, so I'm not sure we want to talk too much about the mating habits of things. But you might sit and wonder how the Neanderthals and the sapiens matched up at when did they meet during a hunt for game or something, and invite them back to the cave for dinner. And then, since there was no language, they had nothing to talk about, so they made it. You don't really know what happened. You don't know if it was forced. There was the tradition in many of these early tribes that they would exchange females to help with inbreeding, to prevent inbreeding. So maybe they just exchange females. So there's lots of possibilities, but there doesn't seem to be any mass slaughter of Neanderthals. There's no bone marks on the bones or anything that would indicate that they were killed during the process. So it may have all been rather peaceful at that point. You know.
Any chance that Neanderthals or Homo sapiens got together with the bonobos or the chimpanzees or the gorillas?
What was that? Well, no, they didn't. No, there's no indication that they mated with any of the other great apes. The other great apes were times when they evolved were about 10 million years ago and about 6 million years ago. So this was way in the future from any of those. The bonobos are a little earlier, but no, there's no indication. Anybody else?
When you look at some of the ancient Indian texts, many of those, there was a vocal tradition of handing down. Some of those are actually prehistoric. There are stories about a prince going out and seeing a demon kingdom and mating with a demon princess. And you think there's some truths to all of this?
No,
You
no,
think
that's why
there's
that's why I'm giving a science talk, not
no,
the other.
but do you think there's some possibility that but these are, we don't know what's true, what is mythology, what isn't. Do you think that's something that was handed down?
No,
Really happened?
the scribes weren't around till about 5,000 years ago, something like that. So all this stuff is prehistory, and only DNA records prehistory. They records it back at least 900,000 years ago, and it's all there written in the DNA if you know how to look for it. And which is the amazing part. The fact that most people don't believe it is also amazing. But it's all written down, and if you know what you're looking for, you could even figure out which bacteria was affecting people at a particular time in history. Which virus? About 8% of our genome is old viruses that are in there as a marker. So.
Hey, I have a question about when you said that the Neanderthal DNA had been decoded. How did they? What was the proof that was offered that this, in fact, is the complete Neanderthal genome?
Well, they've actually subsequently done many Neanderthal genomes. And
Mhm.
there's actually very little variation in the Neanderthal genome
Mm,
over time, much more in the sapien genome.
mm.
So it's pretty clear that this is what Neanderthals look like from a DNA perspective.
Well, the very first, well, I want to follow up on that. Somebody claimed that this is the the the, the bona fide Neanderthal DNA. How could they be so sure that that was
Well, then you
the
bring
one?
in a paleontologist and he picks the bones
Uh,
or she picks the bones
uh,
and they do the analysis. In the first case, they actually looked at, I think, 12 different bones in a cave in Croatia to get the first complete sequence of Neanderthal. But they've done Neanderthals back to 400,000 years, and they all are very, very similar until the sapiens showed up.
Size, and that's how the DNA was then assumed it was Neanderthal.
Well, there are certain markers on the bones and where they came from and all that kind of stuff, the age of them and so forth, that indicated to the paleontologists that these were Neanderthal bones. Little did they know later that the later ones in the 50,000 year range were becoming more and more sapien-like. They couldn't tell that by looking at the bone, but in general, they could tell that this was a Neanderthal. Probably the skull was there and all that. This was all done, by the way, this is all done in caves that only the ancient DNA only really works in a cold climate. You can't get ancient DNA more than about 10,000 years ago in Africa or China or most of those places. It's too hot and the DNA just degrades too quickly. So the best place to find it is in a glacier. They've did ancient DNA on a mastodon or whatever it was, and a million-year-old mastodon. So if it's frozen, it's great. So all this stuff works real well in the caves in the northern part of Europe. All right. Okay.